Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Deadwood, Dakota Territory. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the late summer of 1876, as gold fever gripped the Black Hills and lawlessness defined the newly established mining camp of Deadwood, a curious structure appeared at the edge of town where the winding road from Cheyenne first enters the gulch. The Wellington Sisters boarding house and saloon stood apart from the other establishments that lined the muddy thoroughfare now known as Main Street. Unlike the notorious Gem Theater, owned by Al Swearingen, or the more respectable Grand Central Hotel, the Wellington establishment occupied a curious position, both geographically and in the social hierarchy of the booming settlement. According to records from the Deadwood Historical Society archived in 1962, the saloon sat approximately a quarter mile from the center of the camp, just beyond where the cemetery would later be established. This position, situated between the land of the living and the dead, would later seem darkly appropriate. The structure itself was unusual for Deadwood at that time. While most buildings were hastily constructed of raw timber, the Wellington Saloon was a two-story clapboard structure with a stone foundation and a full basement, a rarity in the hastily built mining town. County assessment records from 1877 note that the property was valued significantly higher than neighboring structures, despite its peripheral location. The basement in particular would later become the focus of intense speculation. According to building records recovered during a courthouse renovation in 1964, the basement was originally listed as a cold storage facility for game and provisions, a seemingly innocent detail that would take on a more sinister meaning as events unfolded. The sisters arrived in June, merely weeks after General Custer's defeat at Little Bighorn. The Black Hills were still technically Sioux territory under the Fort Laramie Treaty, though the discovery of gold had rendered such legal distinctions meaningless to the flood of prospectors and opportunists pouring into the region. In this lawless interval, before the formal establishment of territorial governance, the Wellington sisters found fertile ground for their enterprise. The proprietors, Abigail Wellington, 32, and Eleanor Wellington, 27, arrived in Deadwood in June of 1876, merely months after the initial gold rush began. They traveled, according to passenger manifests, from the Cheyenne to Deadwood stage line, with an unusually large amount of luggage and equipment for two unmarried women. The sisters claimed to have come from St. Louis, though later investigations would reveal no trace of them in that city's records prior to 1874. Their arrival coincided with the height of the Black Hills gold rush, when Deadwood's population swelled with miners, gamblers, prostitutes, and opportunists of every stripe. The timing was perfect for two enterprising women to establish a business catering to the overwhelmingly male population. A letter discovered in 1958 among the personal effects of Richard Bullock, brother to the famed lawman Seth Bullock, provides one of the few first-hand accounts of the sisters' arrival. "Two women arrived on yesterday's stage," he wrote to his wife in Michigan, "unlike any I have seen in this camp. They carry themselves like ladies of quality, yet there is something in their manner that suggests they are accustomed to difficulty. The elder one, when helping unload their trunks, lifted a crate that would challenge most men. They have purchased the old Swenson claim at the edge of town and speak of establishing a dining house." Most curious was their luggage. Among the usual trunks were several long wooden cases of the sort used for scientific instruments and an iron-bound chest that required 4 men to move. When asked about its contents, the elder sister merely smiled and said it contained the tools of our trade. The Wellington Saloon quickly developed a reputation for two things: exceptional food and the striking beauty of its proprietors. The sisters were described in multiple accounts as being remarkably similar in appearance despite their age difference, both tall, with auburn hair and unusual amber-colored eyes. A feature in the Black Hills Pioneer from August 1876 described them as handsome women of refined bearing, whose presence brings a touch of civilization to our rough camp. What the article failed to mention was the sisters' third notable trait, their exceptional skill with knives. According to multiple accounts, Abigail Wellington could carve a side of beef with such precision and speed that men would gather just to watch her work. The way she handled that blade, wrote one miner in a letter home, preserved in the Dakota Territory Historical Collection, was something between a surgeon and a sculptor. Never seen hands move so fast. Eleanor, the younger sister, managed the front of the house and the rooms upstairs. She was described as charming but reserved, with a memory that bordered on the uncanny. That woman never forgot a face or a name, recalled James Harrington in an account published in the Deadwood Chronicle in 1892. She'd remember what you drank and what you'd said months back, even if you'd only been in once before. This exceptional memory would later be noted as significant when men began to disappear. A report filed by a Wells Fargo agent in August 1876, recently discovered during archival digitization efforts at the South Dakota Historical Society, noted another peculiarity about Eleanor Wellington. The younger sister keeps meticulous records in a series of leather-bound books. I observed her making entries after each transaction, noting not merely financial details, but apparent observations about the customers themselves. When I inquired about this practice, she explained it as a method of tracking preferences to better serve regular patrons. However, the intensity with which she studies certain individuals suggests a purpose beyond mere customer service. The Wellington Saloon operated unlike other establishments in Deadwood. It was not open at all hours, as was common for saloons in mining towns. Instead, it opened only from 4 in the afternoon until midnight and was closed entirely on Sundays. The meals were served promptly at 6 and 9 in the evening, and those who missed these times would find themselves unable to secure food, regardless of their wealth or standing. The upstairs rooms were available only to certain customers, those who had become regulars and were known to the sisters. These unusual business practices might have doomed another establishment, but the quality of the food and liquor, described as far superior to anything else available in the camp, ensured a steady stream of customers. An interview conducted in 1942 with Henry Lawson, who had been a boy of 12 in Deadwood during this period, provides additional context about the saloon's reputation. My father forbade me from going anywhere near the Wellington place, though he himself dined there at least once a week. He'd come home talking about the food in a way I'd never heard him speak of my mother's cooking, said the meat melted in your mouth and left you feeling stronger than before you ate it. The strange thing was how the place affected him. He'd be in fine spirits the evening after dining there, almost giddy, but by the next morning he'd be irritable and distracted, as if he was already craving his next meal there. I once asked why we couldn't all go as a family, and he looked at me with such alarm that I never mentioned it again. "That's no place for women and children," he said, though he couldn't explain exactly why. The Wellington establishment quickly became known for its house specialty, a rich, savory stew that was available each evening in limited quantities. Those who tasted it described it in terms that bordered on the reverential. "There is something in that dish that I have never encountered before or since," wrote Joshua Hargreaves, a mining engineer, in his personal journal dated September 1876. "The meat is tender beyond belief, with a sweetness underlying the savory elements that lingers on the tongue. I find myself thinking of it at odd moments throughout the day, planning my schedule around ensuring I will not miss the evening service." This journal, discovered among Hargreaves's effects after his disappearance in November of that same year, would later be entered into evidence during the investigation. The first disappearance occurred in September of 1876. Thomas Cade, a successful prospector who had struck a modest vein near Whitewood Creek, was last seen entering the Wellington Saloon on the evening of September 12th. According to the marshal's report, filed and later discovered in a collection of documents during the courthouse renovation of 1963, Cade had been celebrating his recent good fortune and was carrying a significant amount of gold. When questioned, the Wellington sisters stated that Cade had enjoyed his meal, paid for several rounds of drinks for other patrons, and left their establishment around 11 that evening, intending to return to his claim outside of town. His body was never found, though his empty cabin showed no signs of having been visited after that night. What the official report doesn't mention, but which emerges from cross-referencing various accounts, is that Cade had become a regular at the Wellington Saloon in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Several witnesses noted that he had developed a particular fondness for Abigail Wellington, often bringing her small gifts, a silk ribbon from a merchant's new stock, a silver brooch he had panned himself. He followed her with his eyes like a starving man watching a cook, recalled William Fremont, a fellow miner, in testimony given in 1877. And when she would serve him his meal, touching his shoulder as she set down his plate, I swear the man nearly shuddered with pleasure. Perhaps most telling was the testimony of Samuel Pike, who shared a drink with Cade on his last evening. According to an interview published in the Deadwood Daily in 1892, Pike recalled, "Tom told me he'd been invited to stay after hours that night. Said it with a wink and a nod, like he was finally getting what he'd been angling for. He mentioned that Abigail had told him she had something special waiting for him in the basement, a private reserve, she called it. I assumed he meant some fancy liquor, but he had this look about him, like a man about to get his dearest wish." In the following months, at least 3 other men vanished after being seen at the Wellington Saloon. A pattern began to emerge. All were individuals who had come into sudden wealth, either through mining success, gambling, or other means. All were relative newcomers to Deadwood, without deep connections to the community, and all had been observed displaying their newfound wealth at the Wellington sisters' establishment. Marshal Seth Bullock, newly appointed to bring order to the chaotic camp, noted these disappearances in his records, but found no evidence directly connecting them to the Wellingtons. The sisters maintain a cleaner and more orderly business than most in this camp, he wrote in his official log, recovered and preserved by the Deadwood Historical Society in 1962. Without evidence, I cannot pursue suspicions based merely on coincidence. The second disappearance, occurring in late October, followed a similar pattern. Jeremiah Wells, a former Baptist minister who had abandoned his calling for the promise of gold, had enjoyed moderate success at a claim near Deadwood Creek. According to his boarding house proprietor, Martha Staples, Wells had taken to dining at the Wellington Saloon almost nightly in the week before he vanished. He spoke of the food as if it were manna from heaven, Staples later testified, said he'd never tasted meat so satisfying. The night he disappeared, he told me he'd been invited to a private tasting of some sort. He seemed quite excited, though I found it curious that he mentioned it was to take place after the normal closing time. The third disappearance brought slightly more attention, as it involved Daniel Cooper, a representative of the Homestake Mining Company who had arrived in Deadwood to assess potential acquisitions. Cooper was carrying company funds and was known to be staying at the Grand Central Hotel. His last known location, according to the hotel register, was dining at the Wellington establishment on the evening of November 20th. When he failed to return, a more thorough search was organized, though like the others, no trace was ever found. The fourth and final documented disappearance before winter set in was perhaps the most telling. Patrick Donovan, a successful gambler known for his cautious nature and keen observational skills, vanished in early December. What distinguishes Donovan's case is that he left behind a partial record of his suspicions. A small notebook found among his possessions at the Four Aces boarding house contained entries regarding the Wellington sisters that suggested he had been watching them with professional interest. "There is something calculated in the way they select their special guests," he wrote on December 1st. "They show particular attention to men who are new to the camp, who have come into money, and who have few connections here. The elder sister, Abigail, has a way of assessing a man that reminds me of how I evaluate an opponent at cards, looking for weaknesses, patterns, tells. I've noticed that they seem particularly interested in men of a certain physical type, robust, well-fed, in good health, never the sick or desperate or too lean ones that make up half the camp. Donovan's final entry, dated December 4th, reads, "I've been invited to stay after hours tomorrow night." Abigail mentioned a private card game with select guests, but something in her manner struck me as false. I've accepted to see what lies behind these invitations that precede disappearances, but as a precaution, I've left letters with instructions at the Wells Fargo office to be sent, if I don't retrieve them by week's end. These letters, if they existed, were never found, and Donovan himself vanished without trace after being seen entering the Wellington Saloon on the evening of December 5th. The winter of 1876-1877 was particularly harsh in the Black Hills. Heavy snow isolated Deadwood for weeks at a time, cutting off supply lines and communication with the outside world. During this period, the Wellington Saloon remained one of the few establishments that never seemed to run short of provisions. Even as other businesses began to serve increasingly meager portions, the sisters continued to offer hearty stews, roasts, and pies that drew hungry miners in from the cold. When asked about their seemingly endless supply of meat, Abigail Wellington would smile and simply say, "Good planning and careful storage." A curious detail emerges from the personal diary of Dr. Isaiah Fleming, the camp's primary physician during this period. His journal, discovered during the demolition of his former residence in 1967, contains several entries expressing puzzlement over the complete absence of scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies among regular patrons of the Wellington Saloon during that winter. "It defies medical understanding," he wrote in February 1877, "that men who subsist almost entirely on meals taken at the Wellington establishment show none of the typical signs of winter malnutrition that plague the rest of the camp. Their meat, in particular, seems to provide something that prevents the usual deterioration of health in these conditions." Dr. Fleming's scientific curiosity eventually led him to request samples of the sisters' meat for examination. According to his journal, this request was politely but firmly denied. "Miss Abigail informed me that their recipes and provisions are a family secret," he wrote on February 12th. "When I pressed the matter, suggesting a simple professional interest in its apparent health benefits, her demeanor changed in a manner that I found disquieting. 'Doctor,' she said, 'some mysteries are better left unexamined.' There was something in her gaze that silenced further inquiry on my part. An account from Jacob Morrow, a butcher who operated a shop in the center of Deadwood, adds another layer to the winter mysteries surrounding the Wellington Saloon. In a statement given to a journalist in 1892, Morrow recalled, "What struck me as odd was that they never bought meat from me, nor from any other butcher in town that I knew of. Every other eating house came to us, especially in winter when hunting was difficult. I asked Eleanor about it once, and she said they had arrangements with private hunters who brought them game from outside the immediate area. But in the dead of winter, with snow blocking the passes, no hunter was bringing fresh meat into Deadwood then. Yet their stew pots never emptied." The sisters' business thrived during these harsh months, with their establishment often filled to capacity during mealtimes. Yet another peculiarity was noted by several observers. Despite the crowds, there were never any disruptive incidents at the Wellington Saloon. No drunken brawls, no gunplay, no heated arguments, unusual in a mining town where violence was a regular occurrence. "There was something about that place that kept men docile," recalled Michael O'Leary, a former miner, in an interview conducted in 1938. "Even the roughest characters behaved themselves inside those walls. I remember Tom Blackwood, who'd shot a man for stepping on his boot at the gym, sitting quietly at his table, waiting for his food with this peaceful expression I'd never seen on him before or after. It was like the place cast some kind of spell. As winter thawed the passes and Deadwood became reconnected with the outside world, a new figure arrived who would ultimately bring about the unraveling of the Wellington sisters' operation. Robert Prescott, a Pinkerton detective, came to Deadwood ostensibly looking for a bank robber who had fled west after a heist in Chicago. According to Pinkerton agency records, accessed by historian William Thornton in 1968, Prescott's actual assignment was to investigate the series of disappearances that had begun to draw attention even beyond the Black Hills. His approach was methodical. He took a room at the Grand Central Hotel and began to establish himself as a regular presence in the camp, visiting each saloon and gaming house with apparent casual interest. Prescott's initial impressions of Deadwood, recorded in his journal, reflect the challenge facing any lawman in the settlement. This place exists in a state of organized chaos. Men appear and disappear daily, most leaving no more trace than footprints in mud. The population shifts constantly, with new arrivals and departures on every stage. In such conditions, a man could vanish for any number of reasons: claim jumping, gambling debts, Indian attacks, or simple mishap in the dangerous terrain. That several such disappearances might share a common cause is a theory that requires substantial evidence before it can be seriously entertained. When Prescott first visited the Wellington Saloon in April 1877, he noted in his journal that he was immediately struck by several unusual aspects of the operation. First was the sisters themselves. Their refinement seemed out of place in the rough frontier town. Second was the clientele. Unlike other saloons, where miners mingled with gamblers and laborers, the Wellington establishment seemed to cater to a more prosperous element. And third was the basement door, a heavy oak barrier with an unusual lock visible behind the bar that seemed excessive for a simple storage area. According to his notes, recovered decades later from Pinkerton archives, Prescott wrote, "The door bears more resemblance to a bank vault than a cellar entrance. When I inquired casually about it, the elder Miss Wellington informed me with unusual firmness that it led only to their private storage and living quarters, and was not open to patrons under any circumstances." What particularly caught Prescott's attention was the behavior of the regular patrons. "These men exhibit signs that in another context I would associate with opium habitués," he wrote after his third visit. "They arrive precisely at mealtime, displaying an anticipation that borders on physical craving. They eat with a focus that excludes conversation, and afterwards sit in a state of evident satisfaction that seems disproportionate to the mere consumption of food, however well prepared. Most telling is their loyalty. I have not identified a single regular patron who dines elsewhere, even occasionally. Their devotion to the establishment has the character of dependence rather than preference." Prescott's investigation proceeded slowly and carefully. He cultivated a relationship with Eleanor Wellington, presenting himself as a successful businessman looking to invest in the growing settlement. Over several weeks, he became a regular at the saloon, always arriving for the 6 o'clock meal and engaging Eleanor in conversation while observing the operation. In his reports, he noted that certain patrons, particularly those who were new to town and demonstrated wealth, would sometimes be invited to stay after the regular closing time. These men would often not be seen again, or would appear days later with vague stories about having traveled to neighboring claims or settlements. As April turned to May, Prescott's journals show his growing certainty that the Wellington Saloon was at the center of the disappearances. He noted subtle patterns in the sisters' behavior, the way they would identify and cultivate relationships with potential targets, the signals they would exchange when a particular customer drew their interest, the careful way they monitored the effects of their food on regular patrons. "I am increasingly convinced," he wrote on May 10th, "that some agent in the food itself creates a dependency in those who consume it regularly. The symptoms are subtle but unmistakable, a kind of restlessness that appears as the usual mealtime approaches, followed by visible relief when the food is consumed. This would explain the extraordinary loyalty of their regular customers and possibly provide a means of ensuring compliance in those selected for whatever fate befalls them after hours." Prescott's breakthrough came on the night of May 17, 1877. Having gained the trust of the sisters over the previous weeks, Prescott was invited to stay after hours for what Eleanor described as a special private event for distinguished guests. His detailed account of that evening, preserved in the Pinkerton files and later partially published in the Deadwood Chronicle in 1892 after all principals were deceased, provides the most complete picture of what occurred in the Wellington Saloon after the doors were locked to regular customers. According to Prescott, after the last regular patron departed around midnight, 5 men remained, himself, 2 miners who had recently struck gold in a claim near Strawberry Creek, a cattle buyer from Cheyenne with a considerable sum in bank drafts, and a professional gambler who had won heavily at the Bella Union the previous night. Eleanor Wellington served a special reserve whiskey, which Prescott later noted had a slightly bitter aftertaste that he found suspicious. He pretended to drink while observing the others, who soon began to show signs of drowsiness and confusion. Prescott's report details his observations with clinical precision. The effects manifested gradually but unmistakably, first a slurring of speech, then a laxity in the facial muscles, followed by an inability to maintain an upright posture. Throughout this progression, the subjects remained conscious but increasingly incapacitated. Within approximately 20 minutes of consuming the doctored spirits, all 4 men were effectively immobilized, capable of responding to direct instructions, but unable to resist or flee. As the other men's conditions deteriorated, Abigail Wellington emerged from the kitchen, carrying not food, but several lengths of rope and a collection of knives that Prescott described as more suited to a surgeon's practice than a kitchen. The detective, realizing he was witnessing the prelude to something sinister, managed to feign the same symptoms affecting the other men while remaining alert. Most tellingly, they displayed no alarm at their condition, suggesting the compound includes some agent that suppresses anxiety or induces a state of suggestibility. What he observed next forms the core of the Wellington sisters' dark legacy in Deadwood. The sisters worked with practiced efficiency, binding the incapacitated men and dragging them one by one toward the basement door. Prescott, maintaining his pretense of drugged unconsciousness, was able to glimpse the basement when the door was opened. What he saw in the light of a single lantern carried by Eleanor was a space that bore little resemblance to a simple storage cellar. The walls were lined with what appeared to be medical equipment and preservation jars. A large central table, with gutters along its edges leading to collection buckets, dominated the space. And most disturbingly, suspended from ceiling hooks, were what Prescott described as human carcasses in various stages of processing, hung in the manner of slaughtered game. Prescott's report continues with a detachment that suggests professional training overriding natural horror. The basement had been converted into a processing facility of disturbing efficiency. The central table was equipped with drainage channels and positioned beneath a pulley system fixed to the ceiling. Along one wall stood a series of large vessels that appeared to be for rendering. Another held preserving tanks containing what I must reluctantly identify as human organs. Most horrifying was the methodical organization of the space. This was not the lair of frenzied killers, but a calculated operation refined through evident practice. Realizing the imminent danger, Prescott abandoned his ruse, drawing a concealed derringer and attempting to escape. In the ensuing struggle, he was wounded by Abigail Wellington, who proved remarkably adept with her knives. Despite his injury, Prescott managed to flee the saloon and make his way to Marshal Bullock's office. His wounds, coupled with the effects of whatever drug had been partially administered to him, caused him to collapse before he could provide a complete account of what he had witnessed. The following morning, a visibly injured Prescott led Bullock and a group of deputies to the Wellington Saloon. They found the establishment locked and seemingly abandoned. Forcing entry, the lawmen discovered evidence of a hasty departure, half-packed trunks, scattered personal items, and a still-burning stove in the kitchen. When they breached the basement door, however, the full horror of the Wellington sisters' operation was revealed. According to Marshall Bullock's official report, preserved in territorial records and later transferred to the South Dakota Historical Society in 1964, the basement of the Wellington Saloon had been converted into a butchery of human flesh that defies all civilized description. The space contained specialized equipment for the processing of bodies, preservation chemicals, and storage facilities that suggested an operation that had been refined over considerable time. Most disturbing were the detailed ledgers found in a locked cabinet recording weights, cuts, and quality assessments of what appeared to be dozens of victims dating back several years before the sisters' arrival in Deadwood. The ledgers, portions of which were transcribed for the official record, revealed a systematic approach to their enterprise that shocked even the hardened lawmen of the frontier. Each entry included the victim's name, physical characteristics, estimated weight of usable meat, and notations about quality and flavor. More disturbing still were the customer notes sections, which tracked the reactions of unwitting patrons to specific preparations. Stew made from subject number 27, J. Wells, received exceptional praise. Read one entry from November 1876, especially from Mayor Wagner, who requested recipe. Liver particularly tender, set aside portion for private reserve. Another ledger, labeled simply Effects, contained meticulous records of valuables taken from victims, gold dust, coins, watches, and personal items, along with notation of where each item was sold or pawned. This business-like approach extended to every aspect of their operation, with separate accounting for the legitimate portion of their business and the proceeds from their victims. The level of organization suggested not merely opportunity or desperation, but a calculated enterprise operating according to its own twisted logic. The most horrifying realization, which quickly spread through the camp despite Bullock's attempts to control the information, was that the Wellington sisters had been serving their victims to unwitting customers. The exceptional quality of their meat, their ability to maintain supplies through the harsh winter, and the strange nutritional benefits noted by Dr. Fleming all took on a ghastly new significance. The sisters had been operating what amounted to a processing operation, selecting victims from among those who would not be immediately missed, converting them into food, and serving them to the very community that would eventually consume portions of their missing members. Dr. Fleming, upon learning the truth about the meat he had so admired, conducted tests on samples recovered from the sisters' kitchen. His findings, documented in a report to Marshall Bullock that was later sealed by court order until 1960, confirmed the worst. The substance is unquestionably human flesh, prepared in a manner that disguises its origin. Most disturbing is the presence of an unidentified compound in the preserved samples, possibly a derivative of certain fungi or plants with psychotropic properties. This may explain the unusual satisfaction reported by consumers and the apparent dependency that developed in regular patrons. In effect, the Wellington sisters were not merely feeding their customers human flesh, but conditioning them to crave it through chemical manipulation. The Wellington sisters themselves were never found. Despite an extensive manhunt that extended throughout the Dakota Territory and beyond, they vanished as completely as many of their victims had before them. Unconfirmed reports placed them in various locations over the subsequent years. A similar operation was suspected in a remote mining camp in Colorado in 1879, and rumors of a pair of sisters matching their description emerged from Seattle in 1883. But no confirmed sighting was ever documented. The most credible theory, based on passenger manifests reviewed by historian Thomas Rayburn in 1966, suggests they may have fled to Australia, where numerous unidentified passengers arrived in Melbourne throughout 1877-1888. A curious footnote to their disappearance emerged in 1885, when a San Francisco newspaper reported on the case of a high-end restaurant in the city's financial district, operated by a refined widow of unusual culinary skill. According to the article, The establishment had developed a devoted following among the city's elite, until the unexplained disappearance of a prominent banker led to an investigation of the premises. The proprietor vanished before she could be questioned, and though the article makes no explicit connection to the Wellington case, the parallels are suggestive. The woman was described as tall, auburn-haired, and possessed of unusual amber eyes, a description matching Abigail Wellington. The Wellington Saloon itself was burned to the ground by outraged citizens before a proper forensic examination could be completed. Marshall Bullock, in his personal correspondence discovered during the compilation of his biography in 1965, expressed regret at the destruction of evidence, but acknowledged that the psychological wound inflicted on this community required the cauterization that only fire could provide. The site remained vacant for decades, with no structure being built on the foundation until well into the 20th century. The aftermath of the Wellington case had profound effects on Deadwood society. Those who had been regular patrons of the saloon faced a horrifying realization. They had unwittingly participated in cannibalism, possibly consuming friends or acquaintances who had disappeared. Some left the settlement immediately, unable to face the knowledge or the suspicions of their neighbors. Others fell into depression or turned to alcohol, haunted by what they had consumed. A few, most disturbing of all, were reported to express a persistent craving for the sisters' cooking even after learning its true nature. Solomon Parker, a miner who had dined regularly at the Wellington Saloon, provided a troubling account in a letter to his brother dated June 1877. "I know what they were serving, God help me, I know it now. The thought should sicken me, should drive me to self-destruction for having partaken of such an abomination. Yet in my darkest moments I find myself remembering the taste, the satisfaction that nothing since has equaled. What does that make me? What corruption did they plant in my soul that I should feel this way? I cannot stay in this place. I cannot trust myself among men anymore." The true extent of the Wellington sisters' activities may never be known. Estimates based on the recovered ledgers suggest that between 20 and 30 individuals may have been processed in the Deadwood operation alone, with indications that this was not their first such enterprise. The psychological impact on the community was profound. Many longtime residents of Deadwood abandoned the settlement in the aftermath of the revelations, unable to reconcile themselves with the possibility that they had unknowingly participated in cannibalism. A partial explanation for the sisters' methodology may lie in the discovery of a small library found in their quarters. Among standard cookbooks and household management guides were several unusual volumes: a medical text on the preservation of anatomical specimens, a butcher's manual with detailed diagrams of sectioning techniques, and, most telling, a leather-bound volume in French titled Les propriétés nutritives de la chair humaine, the nutritional properties of human flesh. This last item, according to the Marshal's inventory, contained theories regarding the supposed benefits of anthropophagy, including increased vigor, resistance to disease, and extension of lifespan. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Wellington case, and the reason it continues to resonate nearly a century and a half later, is the sisters themselves. Unlike other killers of the frontier era, who were typically men acting from obvious motives of greed or passion, Abigail and Eleanor Wellington represent something more calculated and incomprehensible. Their background, what little can be verified, suggests education and refinement. Their method required planning, medical knowledge, and a level of coordination that speaks to a partnership of unusual dedication. And their motive remains elusive. While they certainly profited from their victims' valuables, the elaborate nature of their operation suggests something beyond simple robbery. A partial explanation may lie in a fragment of correspondence recovered from their quarters, apparently part of a letter Abigail was writing before their hasty departure. The incomplete text, preserved in the territorial archives and examined by psychologist Dr. Margaret Holloway in 1968, reads, And so, we continue Father's work, though in our own manner. The frontier provides the freedom he always sought but never found. Here, where life is held cheap and men disappear without question, we have at last perfected the process. Eleanor still maintains that the consumption is merely practical, a means of disposal. But I know better. There is power in it, in watching them consume their own kind without knowledge. A secret communion that transforms mere sustenance into something transcendent. Each day they return, hungering for more, never understanding why our humble fare satisfies so completely. The letter breaks off at this point, leaving the full ideology behind their actions unclear. Dr. Holloway's analysis suggested that the sisters may have been acting out a pathology inherited or learned from their father, whoever he may have been. The reference to father's work implies a continuation rather than an innovation, raising disturbing questions about their upbringing and influences. A partial corroboration of this theory emerged in 1967 when a historian researching medical practices of the 19th century discovered records of a doctor, Edward Wellington, who had practiced in Philadelphia until 1860, when he was dismissed from the medical college where he taught anatomy, following allegations of unorthodox experiments and acquisition of specimens through questionable means. The records indicate he had two daughters, ages 16 and 11 at the time of his dismissal. While direct lineage to the Wellington sisters cannot be conclusively established, the coincidence of name, timing, and certain elements of methodology is suggestive. The most tantalizing clue to their background came from an unexpected source, a Lakota elder named Yellowbird, who provided testimony to historian Robert Larson in a 1954 oral history project. According to Yellowbird, whose grandfather had been among the last Lakota to leave the Black Hills region after the gold rush began, there were stories among his people about two pale women with fire hair and eyes like wolves who had established a camp in a remote area near Bear Butte in the winter of 1875, before the rush of miners into Deadwood Gulch. They came first to learn, Yellowbird related. My grandfather said they traded good whiskey for knowledge of how to survive the winters here. They asked many questions about preserving meat, about herbs that grow in these hills, about which plants can make a man see spirits or sleep without dreaming. They were not afraid like other white women. They watched the butchering of buffalo with eyes that learned, not eyes that turned away. Some of the elders warned that these women had wrong spirits, not evil in the way white men often said Indians were evil, but wrong in a way that has no word, like a creature wearing the skin of something else. If this account is accurate, it suggests the Wellington sisters had been planning their Deadwood operation well in advance, learning techniques from the indigenous population that would later be incorporated into their process. The reference to plants that could make a man sleep without dreaming is particularly notable in light of the sedative they used on their victims. This period of preparation would explain how they were able to establish their operation so quickly and effectively upon arriving in Deadwood. In the decades following the Wellington case, rumors and folk tales multiplied throughout the Black Hills region. Stories of mysterious women opening restaurants in remote locations became a standard cautionary tale, and an unusual wariness about unfamiliar food establishments persisted well into the 20th century. The case also had a lasting impact on Deadwood itself. The town's already notorious reputation was further darkened, and even as it transitioned from mining camp to established settlement, the shadow of the Wellington sisters lingered in local memory. One persistent legend, documented by folklorist Martin Healy in his 1938 collection Black Hills Whispers, tells of a yearly phenomenon at the former site of the Wellington Saloon. According to local belief, on the anniversary of the discovery of their operation, the ground seeps a reddish fluid that smells of copper and herbs. Though scientific investigation in 1952 attributed similar staining to mineral deposits in the soil, the legend persists, with some older residents refusing to walk past the location after dark, particularly in mid-May. Archaeological work conducted at the former saloon site in 1963 as part of a broader historical survey of early Deadwood, discovered portions of the stone foundation that had survived the fire. Ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies in the soil beneath and around the former structure that suggested buried materials. Limited excavation uncovered bone fragments that were initially assumed to be standard kitchen waste until laboratory analysis identified them as human. The excavation was quickly halted and the site reburied, with the findings sealed by court order until 1968, when a limited scholarly report was permitted for historical documentation purposes only. This report, authored by Dr. William Chambers of the University of South Dakota, concluded, "The remains discovered at the Wellington site represent a minimum of 7 individuals based on duplications of specific bone elements. Cut marks on the bones are consistent with butchering techniques rather than ritual or warfare practices. Of particular note is the precision of the cuts, which suggests formal training or considerable experience. Comparative analysis with other 19th century cases of survival cannibalism, e.g., the Donner Party, shows significant differences in approach, where survival cannibalism typically presents as crude, expedient processing. These remains show systematic, standardized techniques more analogous to commercial meat preparation. The most recent development in the Wellington case came in 1967, when renovation work at the Gem Theater, which had survived Deadwood's numerous fires, uncovered a sealed space between walls. Inside was a small leather-bound book that appeared to be Eleanor Wellington's personal diary. The document, which covers the period from their arrival in Deadwood through February 1877, provides unsettling insights into the sisters' daily operations, but maintains a strategic vagueness about their central activities. References to processing, special reserves, and private stock appear throughout alongside more mundane business concerns. Perhaps most chilling are the occasional culinary notes with detailed observations about which cuts and preparations received the most praise from unwitting customers. The diary also reveals tensions between the sisters that had not been apparent from other sources. A grows increasingly reckless, reads an entry from January 1877. She speaks too freely with the doctor about our special provisions and seems to take pleasure in hinting at our methods. I have reminded her that discovery would mean not merely flight, but likely death at the hands of a mob, yet she seems almost to court the danger. There is something in her that craves recognition for what we do, not merely the skill of preparation, but the act itself. This hunger for acknowledgement may destroy us if I cannot check it." Another entry, dated February 14th, offers one of the few explicit references to their activities. "Valentine's Day brought us a suitable gift, a young miner flush with his first substantial find. A marked him last week, noting his solitary habits and lack of correspondence with family. After closing, he accepted our invitation readily enough. He proved ideal in composition, lean but well-muscled, with excellent marbling through the shoulder and thigh. A experimented with a new blend of herbs in the marinade, which I believe will be well received by our regulars tomorrow. The gold dust in his pouch will cover our expenses for a fortnight, though I have set aside his pocket watch, a handsome piece that may fetch a good price in Cheyenne when next we send goods for sale." The diary ends abruptly with an entry that reads simply, "A man with watchful eyes has been taking meals with us this week. Abigail dismisses my concerns, but I sense something different about him. He observes more than he consumes. We shall test him soon, but I have prepared our contingency plans regardless. Father always stressed the importance of mobility in our work. If necessary, we will find new hunting grounds." Today, the Wellington sisters case remains one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of the American frontier. It stands as a reminder that the lawlessness and isolation that defined places like early Deadwood created opportunities not just for the standard vices of gambling, prostitution, and theft, but for darker predations that could remain hidden within the chaotic social fabric of boomtowns. The sisters exploited the very condition that defined the frontier, the constant flow of strangers seeking fortune, many of whom disappeared without comment in the normal course of events. A 1959 psychological analysis of the case by Dr. Robert Thornton suggested that the sisters represented a uniquely female adaptation of predatory behavior in the frontier context. Unlike male killers of the era, who typically employed direct violence for immediate gain, the Wellingtons created an elaborate system that weaponized traditionally female domains, cooking, nurturing, hospitality, to disarm and ultimately consume their victims. The genius of their method, Thornton wrote, was in its exploitation of social expectations. No one questioned two women establishing a restaurant, nor thought it suspicious that they excelled at cooking. Their entire operation was hidden beneath a veneer of conventional femininity that deflected suspicion. The Wellington case also raises disturbing questions about community complicity. While the people of Deadwood were victims of an elaborate deception, there were signs that something unusual was occurring. The sisters' ability to maintain meat supplies through winter, the disappearances that followed a pattern, the strange effects of their food on regular customers. That these anomalies were rationalized or ignored speaks to the frontier mentality that privileged individual autonomy over community oversight, creating spaces where the Wellington sisters and others like them could operate with minimal scrutiny. The Wellington Saloon no longer exists except in memory and historical record. The site where it once stood is now occupied by a modern commercial building with no marker to indicate its grim history. Yet the story persists in the collective memory of Deadwood, passed down through generations and occasionally revived when new details emerge from archival research. For those who know the history, there remains a certain unease about that particular location, a reluctance to linger there after dark that defies rational explanation. And somewhere, perhaps in some remote corner of the world, or perhaps in the unmarked graves that likely dot the Black Hills, lie the final secrets of Abigail and Eleanor Wellington, the sisters who served more than meat to the outlaws, miners, and travelers of the Wild West. Their legacy is a dark thread in the tapestry of frontier history, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who appear most civilized, and that in the lawless spaces of human experience, some hungers transcend the merely criminal to touch the truly monstrous.